Good morning and welcome to episode 95 of Duval Rundown. My name is Gus Logue. Today I'm joined as I am each and every Thursday morning by Mia O'Brien, who you can catch the show that she co-hosts, Helmets and Heels, from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern each weekday, 92.5 FM and 1010XL radio. There we go. Today, I'm very excited for this episode because me and I are going to start really diving deep into the draft. Had a really good yesterday, actually, episode 94 with JP Acosta. Would recommend going and checking that out. JP and I just kind of threw out some random names at various positions in various rounds for the Jaguars as potential prospect fits. But Mia and I today are going to be starting a series where we go position by position. So I'm very excited for this. Mia, welcome back. How are you doing?
Feeling good. I'm very excited to actually be in the home studio office, Gus. As I was making our little nice graphic for this episode, I was reminded of the episode we did when I was at the combine, the episode we did while I was at the players, and so
Yep.
feels a little bit. It feels a little bit better. I feel like we're getting back into a rhythm of sorts as we approach less than a month away from the NFL draft, and certainly having my nice little handy dandy notebook.
Mhm.
As I know, producer intern Thomas loves to capture my notebook that I've always got ready to go. Not a ton of little notes here. A lot of them are actually on the phone. Very excited to look at a couple specific defensive tackles who may be a fit for the Jaguars because we really don't know what the Jaguars' needs are, which players on the current roster this new staff values and sees a future forward with versus players who maybe they say that actually is someone who is a patchwork fix because we need to get the next guy.
Yeah, I think this is a great position to start out with because we can touch on Mason Graham to start out, but the consensus, for a while has been that he would be the Jaguars' fifth overall pick, the defensive tackle out of Michigan. And now that free agency has passed and the Jaguars used zero, their 10 free agent pickups on the defensive line. And then James Gladstone said at a March presser that they're going to give rookies a chance to see the field. That obviously points to defensive line / pass rush as a whole being the biggest need for the Jaguars. But like potentially the Jaguars could not take Mason Graham, and then they would certainly be interested in one of these names that we're going to be mentioning later on. But even if the Jaguars do take Mason Graham, I wouldn't be surprised if they end up double dipping, certainly on the defensive line, but even at defensive tackle specifically. I think kind of an under the radar need is potentially like a nose tackle or like really a run stuffing defensive lineman, considering that Devon Hamilton hasn't looked the same since his brutal back injury, and he's now entering 2025, the final year of his contract. And so I think that the Jaguars could go after a couple different types of players. It will be interesting to see what those types of players are, considering that this is a team in Jacksonville. But again, to start off with a Mason Graham conversation, Mia, what do you like about him? What do you don't like? Is everything that you're hearing indicating that the Jaguars will likely spend their fifth pick on Mason Graham?
Yeah, I think, and in speaking with people even outside of the Jaguars organization, I think the whole league likes Mason Graham. But as Dane Brugler of The Athletic put it, I think we as media, we as fans of the game and fans of the league, maybe even higher on him than perhaps those that are actually doing the scouting and the evaluating. He weighed in at 296 at his pro day. And I think that that's a really important note, Gus, because ultimately, the Philadelphia Eagles won the Super Bowl last year with the likes of Jordan Davis of his 330 some odd plus pounds at girth. And then, of course, Jalen Carter, who is also over 300 pounds. And I'm not saying that you need to be over 300 pounds and pass certain thresholds because the day and age of Trent Baalke's thresholds has come and gone here in Jacksonville. But at the same time, if you hear Tony Boselli say, we need to get bigger, is Mason Graham actually making your defensive line bigger? That's why I'm glad you brought up the idea of the Jaguars double dipping. That's where I believe the reality is. Mason Graham's comp, according to Lance Zierlein of NFL.com, is Christian Wilkins. If you're a Jaguars fan, you will sign up for that every day of the week and twice on Sunday because those, quite frankly, it's the Earth theory. There's not that many humans that can do that walking around on planet Earth right now. And you would love to have one of those guys. Ultimately, for me, even going through some of these other defensive line prospects we're going to talk about here today, it's hilarious because the biggest critique on so many of them is leverage and the ability to bend their knees. That is not a concern with Mason Graham. Maybe it's because of the measurables. I like to believe it's because of the wrestling background. And so that's where I feel like for the Jags, you would be getting a player that you haven't had since arguably that sort of prototype the early 2000s, maybe, possibly. And I also think you go back to that early 2000s, and Gus, you tell me, who were the fire and ice, if you may, the lightning and thunder, not MJD and Fred Taylor, but along that defensive front for that 2007 playoff team for the Jaguars, or even in the years preceding it? Who were those two defensive linemen?
Ooh, 2007. I don't know if I'm the right person to be asked this question, honestly.
That's true. I don't even know if you were born then. Big John Henderson.
Okay.
And
I was gonna say John Henderson. I didn't realize he was like still around by 2007.
was there not a certain other defensive lineman next to him?
Tyson Alulu was
Tyson
drafted.
Alualu. He got here in 2010, and that was at the tail. I mean, Big John at that point was gone. I think Tyson almost was supposed to replace Big John. No, I'm thinking of Big Baby as well. And that's where you have two defensive linemen, and Rob Meyer as well. Thank you, Social, in the chat line for bringing up Rob, a rotational guy as well. Point is, you need that big, beefy defensive nose tackle. Thank you. Yes, Justin. And for those of you who don't know, Big Baby, Marcus Stroud. So John Henderson was your nose tackle. You're penetrating Jordan Davis, if you may. He was Jordan Davis before Jordan Davis, I think it's fair to say. And then you have Marcus Stroud next to him, and you have that more of a pass rushing 5-tech, 3-tech, can kind of play a couple different positions along the interior. And so that's where I look at this and I say the Jaguars have an opportunity to not only select Mason Graham with the 5th overall pick and get that penetrating defensive tackle, but then you also, in light of the Devon Hamilton god-awful spinal abscess that occurred 2 years ago and his tough road to recovery back, you do have at the very least depth. At the least, you have depth. If you move on from Devon Hamilton after this year, you have that next guy to pair with Mason Graham for the years to come. And so let's kick it off. I'm not going to bury the lead. The first name I have on my list, we're bringing the Michigan men. We're bringing those intangibly rich, Jim Harbaugh recruited Michigan men, despite a struggling first year. They beat Ohio State, though, so who cares? Under Sharon Moore. I'm bringing Kenneth Grant to the Jacksonville Jaguars because Kenneth Grant fulfills exactly what I just described, that tag team partner to Mason Graham who will create opportunities for him. 340 pounds. He's just 21 years old, 6'4", 33.5-inch arms, 10 1/8 inch hands. For me, again, this is where I think this conversation in this episode is going to be so fascinating. And we appreciate all the comments. Please keep them coming on the YouTube live chat feed with names that you'd like to see paired with the Jaguars at the defensive tackle position. But ultimately, people are going to fire this podcast up, Gus, and they're going to be like, well, the answer is Mason Graham. The reality is, depending on how you view Devon Hamilton long-term and certainly how you view Eric Armstead long-term, not to mention Mason Smith, you are going to need to double dip. And so even if we're rolling with the theory of the Jaguars are taking Mason Graham at 5th overall, who is the Robin to his Batman?
Yeah, that's definitely an important question. Even like if Devon Hamilton ends up being great and earning another contract, even if Eric Armstead sticks around for a long time, even if Mason Smith takes a jump and turns his flashes into consistency and becomes a really good NFL player, like this is different from the offensive line because the offensive line obviously can change throughout the season due to injuries and even poor performance. But like hypothetically for your offensive line, you've got your starting 5 and like you're hoping that you're not going to have to change that. But with the defensive line, like obviously you're hoping that the Jaguars don't do as many of those hockey rotations as they did last year, but like it is a rotating unit. And so again, even if Eric Armstead, Devon Hamilton, Mason Smith, all the other guys that's on the current defensive line unit like end up doing well, it certainly wouldn't be bad to add to that group. And I think especially because like I feel like to go back to Graham for 1 second, like that, I think the biggest kind of hiccup on him is that like, is he really going to be able to pay off the top 5 pick investment by becoming like a top 5 type player at his position? I think it's like his disruption is kind of inevitable because of like how he uses his background in wrestling to be able to like get leverage, understand blocking. He's a fantastic technician in terms of like shedding blocks. But like the weight is kind of like the problem. It's like, he's definitely going to be a good NFL player, excuse me, but is he going to be like more of like a Christian Wilkins who's like a disruptor and like certainly a top 10 player at his position, but like isn't necessarily like a shoe-in for the Pro Bowl every single year? Can he pay off a top 5 selection by like kind of getting past his frame and his sawed-off arms concerns and truly become like that special kind of prospect? But obviously we're kind of like nitpicking there. And like, again, he's going to turn out to be a good pro, but I think with Mason Graham, you certainly have like the disruptor, the penetrative 3 technique type And he can play like one technique, nose tackle, that kind of stuff, but you're just not taking as much advantage of his skills and his talent if you're lining him up over the center. So it definitely makes sense. I think Kenneth Grant certainly is the kind of guy that you can line up over the center as you said, intangibly rich, a hardball guy, definitely has the frame as opposed to Mason Graham. And so I think that either one of those Michigan defensive tackles would certainly make sense for the Jaguars.
300 and what, 40 pounds we said, or 360 pounds, excuse me, is what he actually weighed in at his at his pro day. Gus ran a 4.9 at 360 pounds. So that was at least what was recorded last year. Let me see. Actually, yeah, he didn't actually run that 40 at his pro day. The only numbers right now that I'm seeing are the 22 bench presses on the bench. But yes, last year he was recorded at Michigan as running a 4.9 at 360 pounds, which is mighty fast for a big man. And there also is the argument that can be made that given the number of double teams that Kenneth Grant faced, did that open up Mason Graham's opportunities to be more of that penetrating defensive tackle? And so that's where I think, you kind of take a page out of the playbook of, keeping Trevor and Travis together, or go down the line of players, teammates that have been drafted together. Certainly bringing the entire University of Georgia defense to Philadelphia is one. And you recreate that idea of, hey, it's great that you have this interior inside tackle who can create pressure in the pocket and push the pocket, but you also need those people movers who are going to open him up to actually affect the quarterback too.
Yeah, I feel like very generally, like Mason Graham is just, again, a disruptor, and like what he lacks in frame, especially typical for a defensive tackle in the NFL, he makes up for in superb athleticism that's like pretty much uncountered by a lot of other defensive linemen. Someone said in the comments earlier, no comp, but wasn't Aaron Donald under 300 pounds? I do keep coming back to Aaron Donald when I think about Mason Graham, because like I agree.
Pretty lofty comp there, Gus.
I agree with the comment where like I'm not trying to make a comparison, but just like in terms of like the thoughts in the pre-draft process, like Aaron Donald, like everyone agreed was like a fantastic prospect, but like would he really become, like I was saying with Graham, like a top 5 guy at his position? Obviously, Aaron Donald turned into arguably the greatest non-quarterback of his generation. It's pretty much like him and J.J. Watt over the last 15, 20 years for like best non-quarterbacks, I feel like, especially on the defensive side of the ball. And so like, obviously with Aaron Donald, people were just kind of like overthinking his size, and he was just such, not just like athletic freak, but also a technician to pair with it. And so I do think, again, as the commenter pointed out, he was under 300 pounds. Mason Graham played at around like 306, 310, maybe 315 in college, went down to 296 for the combine just to run. So I think that Mason Graham will play a little bit over 300 pounds in the NFL, but I certainly have come up with kind of like the same comparison in terms of just pre-draft process feel of like maybe we're overthinking these guys just because of their not ideal frames.
Gus, give us a name. Who's the first on your list, a fit for the Jaguars, regardless of round, not named Mason Graham at defensive tackle?
There's a few guys that maybe we'll get to eventually that I've mentioned before. Omar Norman Lott, I mentioned on Helmets and Heels, actually, from Tennessee. I think he had the highest like pass rush win rate, or perhaps just pressure rate, among all FBS defensive tackles last year. So that's definitely a guy that can disrupt and get after the passer if you happen to not take Mason Graham in the first round. I also like Deion Walker a lot from Kentucky. We had a commenter say Deion Walker. He has a pretty high pad level. I feel like is the biggest thing he needs to clean up. But that issue is also kind of mitigated by the realization that he played with a really bad back injury in 2024. And so he was playing upright, like because he was hurt. And despite playing so upright, he still had up there with Omar Norman Lott, like one of the highest pressure rates, win rates, going back for a couple years to Deion Walker. And so he's another guy that can give you pass rush juice. But the number one name that I wanted to bring up today was a name that I had in, I think, my Monday mock draft. If it wasn't this past Monday, it was the Monday before. But Oregon defensive tackle, how do you say his first name? Jamari? That can't be right.
Oh, you're going with Jamari Caldwell.
Jamari Caldwell, yeah.
Oh,
I think he's been I've seen
okay.
some people that I trust hyping up recently. I think he's been going a little bit under the radar during the draft process. Maybe possibly because his teammate Derrick Harmon, who we already mentioned, out of Oregon is going to
Who,
be.
by the way, is my number 2 name. Not to spoil
Okay,
it,
sweet.
but yeah,
So
we'll talk about Derrick Harmon here in a second.
he's probably going to be a first rounder. Maybe Harmon will slip to 36 or like the top of the second round. But Caldwell is more of like certainly a day 2, maybe even early day 3 pick. But I've seen a lot of people comparing him to like BJ Raji Light. This is a guy that is definitely going to be less of like the Mason Graham disruptor type and more of like the Kenneth Grant occupying gaps type, where he's like a true nose tackle, has really broad hips, the girth buzzword you mentioned of a nose tackle, but he does have like a little bit of untapped athleticism. So maybe like a BJ Raji, like he's a really stout run defender for you, but that he can actually provide something on pass downs. I think that, as you kind of mentioned at the top, why this discussion today is important is because generally you do not find a lot of pass rushers, interior defensive linemen with pass rush juice after the first round of NFL drafts. But I do think that even though Mason Graham is the belle of the ball for 2025, you can find some pass rushers later in the round. And so I think Caldwell maybe not is like the pass rusher to target, but I just think that he's got a little bit of upside as well as being a stout run defender.
He may be the Robin if you do get Mason Graham at 5, or again, maybe we're just in the business, Gus, of pairing former college teammates together.
Yeah.
If you trade back, because I agree with you, by all accounts, and Daniel Jeremiah noted it on the Move the Sticks podcast earlier this week, he doesn't think Derrick Harmon's getting out of the first round. He thinks Derrick Harmon is actually going to go in the first round and has had a meteoric rise, if you may. Obviously began his career at Michigan State. And so he didn't actually, begin his career at Oregon, the number 1 team in the country for much of last season. He led FBS in pressures from the interior defensive lineman position. He was 2nd overall in pressures along the defensive line. Again, a guy who can create not only penetration in the pocket, stout run defender as well. And guys like that go in the first round. I actually sat down on today's Thursday, so Tuesday night, and ahead of, spoiler alert, another plug, everyone, Mia's Mock Draft Monday 1.0, which is coming this upcoming Monday. Just for the pure exercise of it, Gus, I tried to do a complete 3-round mock draft for all 32 teams just to see, like looking at, depth charts and having some idea what a couple of these teams may be thinking. I was like, let me go through this. And you just reach a point where a player like Harmon, or since I know we already had somebody ask, when are we going to do the wide receiver version of this episode? We will. Don't worry. We'll get to that. I think we already kind of did because we did the Tesla Nick Nash comp, but that's a story for another time. Point being, as I'm going through it, Derrick Harmon was a player that I said, knowing his skill set and the earth theory, you can't let him fall to the second round. You can't, in good conscience, if you're any of those teams in the 20s, pass on a guy with that skill set, because once you get to the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round, as you alluded to, you're getting stout run defenders, but not necessarily guys that can also give you sack production, directly get to the quarterback. You're getting guys who are going to eat up double teams and eat up blocks for you to create for those other pass or those sack getters. And so that's where, for me, I think that if you're the Jags, if you trade back, I mean, you're not going to probably take him at 10 or 11 or 12, but I mean, again,
maybe you can trade back twice. When Hayes and I were talking about potential trade back scenarios, like if they trade back with, like, they say the Saints to 9th overall, then all of a sudden I feel like that's a pretty good sweet spot for like edge defenders like Michael Williams, Mike Green, etc. Shamar Stewart to potentially start going off the board.
Donovan Ezeraku, don't forget about him.
Yeah, so then maybe teams will try to come to that spot, and like maybe the Jags will be able to trade back twice. I do think it would be easier to trade back from 9 or 10 as opposed to 5, because now that the Raiders, having Geno Smith, don't need a quarterback, I don't know if any team is going to feel like particularly pressured to get to the 5th pick. I mean, hey, maybe the Bears will like jump in front of the Raiders for the right to draft Ashton Genty. But at that point, like, yeah, I think that, as you said, like, I think the earth theory is like the perfect way to sum up why Derrick Harmon will be a first-round pick, is because he is just like, I feel like prototypical is like almost underselling it. He just has like perfect length, perfect size, great athleticism too. I think he can be a little bit better as like a finisher, as a pass rusher, do a little bit better with his footwork. But he is like a guy that should immediately be at least a pocket pusher, which can be really valuable, as we saw with the Rams last season. He could also play like in a variety of roles across the defensive line. And so the frame and versatility pairing, along with like the production that he had at Oregon, he is. I feel like he can't be safer than Mason Graham, because Mason Graham is a pretty sure bet. But I would feel very confident about Derrick Harmon having a long, lengthy career, regardless of where he lands.
So Derrick Harmon also ran a 4.940 at 313 pounds. Again, as Gus alluded to, the length. If Trent Baalke was still the GM, he's probably the pick at 5. I'm just kidding, but I'm also not kidding. 6'4.5" inches tall, 34 3/8 inch arms, 10 3/8 inch hands. He checks every box there. Not that I want to stray away from defensive tackles, Gus, but in light of Will Campbell's comments at LSU Pro Day yesterday, the way that I feel about Mason Graham is a lot like how I feel about what Will Campbell said yesterday, which is Will Campbell sat on the dais on the podium yesterday and said, for 2 years, I have been regarded as, if not the best tackle in my draft class, one of the best. And suddenly, because I have 32.5-inch arms, I am no longer the best tackle in my class. I have never heard about arm length deciding if I'm a good football player or not. But now that I have 33-inch arms, I guess I'm a good football player again. And that honesty, number one, I think that you'll get a similar, maybe not the extroverted nature of Will Campbell. I don't know Mason Graham. Maybe he is that way. But what I do know is that Mason Graham has been talked about as the best defensive tackle and the best pass rushing defensive tackle in this class now for the last 2 years. And just because he's 296 pounds, now we suddenly want to poke holes and say that he's not. That is how I feel. Don't make it harder than it has to be. But again, part of why we're doing this exercise is because it shouldn't just be Mason Graham that the Jaguars are targeting along the defensive line, especially after James Gladstone said, we are going to let these rookies, keyword there, plural, rookies, get out on the grass.
Yeah, absolutely. I got one more name. I was gonna talk a little bit about the guy that JP actually mentioned yesterday, CJ West from Indiana. I think he's definitely worth a look. But I'm gonna go with someone that we had a comment about. Social said Alfred Collins, Texas. I absolutely love this guy. I think that he is a little bit of a polarizing prospect because, again, like he plays with a high pad level, and not because Deion Walker, he had a back injury, but Alfred Collins is just like a mammoth of a man, super tall. Where is his height? He's 6'6", 332 pounds. And so because he's a 6'6" defensive tackle, he does play a little bit high. But whenever he is able to like generate the right pad level and the right leverage, he can be really disruptive because of his great frame. He also has really good length. I don't think that he has as much like untapped potential as a pass rusher as maybe a few other names in this class. But I think that as long as like he's able to clean up that pad level and like a little bit of small technique stuff, then he can be just like a great long-term Devon Hamilton replacement.
And I also can't help but, look at Alfred Collins' story and say, you know what? He's okay being the Robin because he was to not only T'Vondre Sweat as his backup a year and a half ago, but also to Byron Murphy, who in his rookie year maybe wasn't what many expected. Again, that's where this conversation about finding an interior defensive lineman who can push the pocket and actually get to the quarterback is so fascinating, because I think so many of us expect it to be Aaron Donald, where right out of the gate, they're racking up double-digit sacks from the inside. And that's unrealistic, I think. But at the same time, recognizing, much like how you want to set a quarterback up for success by having a capable run game and certainly protecting him up front, I think the same can be said if you bring in, whether it's off the edge or on the inside, if you bring in a double-digit sack guy, he will only be a double-digit sack guy if there are those along the line that are helping create for him. And that's what I think Collins would do for whether it's Mason Graham, whether it's Mason Smith, who's already here, Eric Armstead, the list goes on.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as again, we saw last year with the Rams, even though they lost Aaron Donald, they drafted 2 defensive linemen from the same school, from FSU, with their first 2 draft picks. And like they had also invested a decent amount of draft picks in their defensive line in previous years too. And so, I mean, obviously Jared Verse looks like a star. He won Defensive Rookie of the Year last year, but even still, like it's definitely more of a group effort it was for the Rams last year. And I think that that's what the Jags are going to be trying to go for, and smartly, because like it shouldn't be just a 2-man show of Josh Hines Allen and Trayvon Walker. It's really got to be
like it's been.
Yeah.
And also, thank you for reminding me when I was talking about double dipping from the same school. I missed the obvious connection, the obvious one, which is the one that James Gladstone made happen last year with the Los Angeles Rams of Braden Fisk and Jared Verse.
Absolutely. Mia, there's some other names I could throw out there, but that's pretty much all I got. Is there any other names that you wanted to go through today?
Are you ready for the wild card?
Yeah, let's do it.
The wild card of all wild cards. And so I see CW in the chat already brought up Ty Robinson out of Nebraska. And he has certainly been a name that I have been, as I've been just perusing, trying out some different mock draft combinations. He's certainly a name that I've kept my eye on. But when I watched Nebraska football this past season, especially, of course, when they played the University of Iowa, there was one player along the defensive line who I could not take my eyes off of, to the point that Kevin said to me, I got to look this guy up. He pulls up this guy's profile and he goes, this man screams Nebraska. He screams blue collar. The Jags should take him on day 3. And that man, a combine snub, however, did appear at the East-West Shrine game, is Nash Hutchmacher. Nash Hutchmacher is a guy who I think that Jaguar fans, if you're clamoring for the nasty, if you're looking for that Midwest trench warfare, former wrestler, this is the guy you want to go for. 6'3", 316 pounds. He did 26 reps on the bench earlier this week at his pro day, ran a 5'1", 340, a 4.56 short shuttle. So, hey, a little bit of burst of speed there. Ultimately, for me, this is a guy who not only played 5 years of college football, he also was a college wrestler in the Big Ten for 4 seasons. And so if you want a guy who not only has that background to create great pad level because of the wrestling background, but also someone who has the dedication and has the training regimen to balance playing 2 varsity sports in the year of our Lord 2025, I would argue that's pretty intangibly rich. I love that his defensive line coach was Terrence Knighton, of course, former NFL defensive lineman. And Terrence Knighton tweeted out, and I loved this. I don't know how I didn't see this and why it didn't get more love in Indy. He's now at Florida State, of course. If guys are going to opt out of working out, give another young man a chance to improve his draft stock. Have a media day on a separate day. Nash Hutchmacher not being in Indy is BS. Check the tape. Folks, go back, watch the tape from the Heroes game against Iowa. He wears number 0 as well as a defensive lineman rushing from the interior. He's everywhere. And guess what? He's got some pass rush moves too, which blew my mind when I was watching it live. So fire up the tape, go watch Nash Hutchmacher, because I agree. Like, Ty Robinson's the one who's getting a lot of the love, and I think it's because he's kind of a tweener. He can go inside or outside. At 316 pounds, I'm probably not playing Hutchmacher off the edge, but if you're looking for your hay barrel throwing, corn-fed defensive lineman that you throw a dart at in the 7th round and the 6th round, this is the guy. Tony Pauline, who of course appears on Jaguars Today on 1010XL, says he thinks he's going to go on day 3. The Bills have a private workout with him scheduled for this week. I think the Jags should do the same.
Wow, that's great. I have literally never heard that name before, so that's perfect for today. Nash Hutchmacher.
Yes, Hutchmacher. I think it's Hutchmacher.
Okay. Perfect. So certainly, I feel like a lot
Fire
of
up the tape, Gus. You're gonna get the Iowa highlights alone. Like, we were like, who the hell is this guy? Like, where did he come from?
Well, we got it all covered here on Duval Rundown. Every defensive tackle prospect from Mason Graham to Nash Hutchmacher. Maybe not necessarily.
We should probably note, Gus, since Hef just brought it up in the chat, and I had 5 people send it to me while we've been live. Yes, Big Desmond Watson weighed in at 464 pounds. His running mate, Cameron Jackson, who Hef brought up in the chat, has certainly got a lot of pre-draft love as well. Florida's Pro Day is currently ongoing as we're recording and going live with this podcast. I think both those guys are interesting. I think that they're both dart throws in this on day 3. I would be very scared to draft Dez, just because, again, we've never seen someone in the National Football League play at 464 pounds. So yeah, but Cameron Jackson is certainly a guy who's risen up a lot of boards from what I've seen over the last few months.
Absolutely. Yeah. Maybe Big Dez would be interesting as like a UDFA, but yeah, that's definitely a threshold that I'm sure not very many NFL athletes, if any, have ever cleared, being as heavy as Big Dez is. But yeah, Mia, appreciate you so much. I think that this was a great exercise because certainly threw out some good names, I think, but also I feel like the takeaway for people should be whether or not the Jaguars do take Mason Graham, even if they do get him, you could probably expect them to double dip, try to get some different body types, but really, really address the defensive line and the pass rush. So that'll do it for today. Mia, thank you as always. Watchers/listeners, thank you as always. I will be back tomorrow with Hacker at 9:04 a.m. Eastern. So see you guys then. Adios, guys.